The agenda this week heard what a green farming revolution could do for Canada and the world, and examined how to get Russia out of Ukraine. The agenda's week in review begins assessing who the economy does and doesn't work for. Have a look.
Kaylee, let me try this with you. If you look at the unemployment numbers, they're not bad, relatively speaking, if you look at the last 40, 50 years. We're in a pretty good place right now. Do you think that gives Canadians a false sense of how strong the economy is and that they don't realize we're actually in more trouble, per this report?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that we've seen the labor force shrink a little bit compared to the rest of the economy, and we saw so many retirements or accelerated number of retirements during the pandemic. So the unemployment rate has something to do with that as well. And what I thought we would see during that period of labor tightness is employers start to invest in technology that could work alongside workers to enhance productivity. That would also mean that we would need to raise wages for workers who are working and working alongside that technology, developing that technology. We didn't see that happen. Instead, we saw policies that would just put downward pressure on wages and working conditions, trying to sort of generate some sort of job creation. And also then the Bank of Canada coming in and raising the interest rate so quickly to try and dampen economic growth instead of actually taking the energy that was in the economy right now and sort of boosting us forward.
Graham, can I get you on that? Do you think Canadians don't quite understand that our fundamentals really aren't as good as we'd like to think they are?
Yeah, I think one of the things that people are coming to terms with now is that what was a demographic tailwind for maybe most of Canada's history, if not all of it, is now turning into a headwind. So, for most of our history, we've had a growing population, we've had a growing employment ratio, a certain number of workers relative to the total population, and now that's shifting fundamentally in a way that the dropping unemployment rate, the low unemployment rate, is actually masking some big problems here. Mainly that our employment ratio is dropping and our productivity per worker is not increasing. So the number of hours worked is no longer increasing, and also the productivity per hour worked is not increasing, which means that we're going to run into some big problems in terms of delivering services and actually having really productive economic activity and prosperity.
Sunil.
So everything Graham said is correct, but I don't think the average Canadian thinks in terms of productivity and unemployment rates. They're looking at my housing costs are going up, my food costs are skyrocketing. I make the same or less than my parents did 30 or 40 years ago doing the same kind of job, and I might be working two jobs or in a precarious kind of casual form of employment to make ends meet. Childcare costs, maybe they're going to come down a little bit going forward, but I think the average person is looking at all of the cost factors that are hitting them really hard in their pocketbook. They might have a job, but how secure is that job? So I think for the average person, they don't feel confident, and you can look at those top line numbers like unemployment and productivity and GDP growth, but those don't translate to the person who's living as a single mom in Toronto or with a couple kids in Northern Ontario, and they're wondering what's the future hold for me, and are things going to be better for my child than they are for me? Because we're starting to run into questions about whether or not that's the case going forward.
In which case, let's say all of what we have discussed so far is sort of the prelim for the big question that we want to put on the table right now. And Brett, I'll get you to start on this one. And that is, who is the economy working for? Tackle that if you would.
The economy is principally working for asset owners right now. We've seen since the 2008 financial crisis, the value of almost any good, whether it's real estate, art, equities, or stock investments, go up substantially in an era where we're awash in capital. And by contrast, we haven't seen wages keep up with those asset value increases. So really, the economy is working right now for people who own things. It's not to say, though, that Ottawa hasn't tried very substantially to try to address this. We saw under a series of budgets under former Finance Minister Morneau, cuts in corporate taxes, increases in subsidies to business for research and development. We saw an acceleration in depreciation for tax deductions for capital spending. We are now the only G7 country with free trade agreements with every other G7 country and with every continent in the world. And so we have really gone to the policy toolbox to try to do all the things that business says that it needs in order to invest in improving the situation and the effectiveness of workers. But we haven't seen business come back with the capital spending that was supposed to incent. So the big question to me now is, what more do we need to do? And I think that's a question for business as much as it is for policymakers.
The next green revolution, that is a reference to what?
Well, some of the viewers may remember the first green revolution in the 1950s and 60s when agriculture was transformed globally and we developed all sorts of technologies that allowed us to produce a lot more food, and that has helped feed the world, staved off a lot of starvation in many parts of the world. We need an equal green revolution this time, but the green is on climate. Canadians probably don't appreciate that roughly 10% of our national emissions come from agriculture. When you factor in the whole supply chain, what it takes for fertilizer, what it takes from diesel to get that food to your door, it can run up to 20%. So if we're going to get to net zero, we've got to address agricultural emissions. But there's a bonus to this as well, because agriculture can be a carbon sink. We can absorb greenhouse gas emissions in the soil. And we have a soil base in this country that is almost unequaled in the world. And we've got to put that to work as a national asset and reward farmers as the land stewards for capturing that carbon. That's going to be critical for us to get to net zero. Now, all of this was true 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. What has changed profoundly is what happened in the world last year with the Ukraine war, which in our view was not a one-off. We are going to continue to see geopolitical and geoeconomic disruptions that will affect commodities trades, that will affect the price of oil and gas, the price of food for many years to come. And that creates an additional imperative for Canada as a major exporter of food to the world to produce a lot more food, to produce it more sustainably, and to get it to the parts of the world that are not going to be able to rely on producers like Russia, as they might have in years past.
Okay, a ton to unpack there, so let's start to do that. If the mission is to reduce that 10 or 20% to zero, how well are we doing at that mission so far?
We're, like in a lot of sectors, kind of moving along very slowly, and we need to accelerate that if we're going to get those 100 or so megatons out of our carbon footprint of 720 down to 50, down to zero. Now, fortunately, we have the technologies. We know what to do, but we've got to scale it. We have the technologies to capture more carbon in the soil. We have the technologies to manage livestock better, and we can get into methane emissions. But Canada can be a leader in this. So it's not just about producing more food with fewer emissions for the world. That's kind of job one here. There's also an opportunity to develop the technologies and create kind of a Silicon Valley of agriculture technology, or ag tech as it's called, in places like Guelph, in places like Calgary, and export these technologies as the rest of the world tries to figure out also how to produce more food with fewer emissions.
As you look at the amount of food that we are producing today and the need for whatever amount that is, take us 30 years down the road. Take us almost the year 2050. What's the difference going to be between what we're doing today and what we'll need in 2050?
We're not going to be producing radically different foods. We're not talking about frankenfoods, for instance. We'll still continue to produce a lot of canola, a lot of beef, a lot of dairy products, but we'll be producing them differently and selling them to different markets in the world. You don't even need to go 25 years out. We estimated RBC that Canada will need to export 25% more food by the year 2030. So that's a massive increase in exports. That's actually a benefit for all of Canada.
I want to put another one of your 5 items to you from your Wall Street Journal piece of a month ago, and that is the war should not end with the dismemberment of the Russian Federation. And, well, let me read an excerpt here. This is from the Deputy Director of the International Center for Defense and Security in Tallinn, Estonia, who's written a piece called Don't be afraid of a Russian collapse. It is ironic that Western Europeans are more afraid of escalation than countries closer to Russia, even though the latter would be directly affected by any escalation of the war. Being the object of Russia's imperial policies from the 1700s to the present day has taught the Baltic countries and Poland to fear Russian strength more than weakness, and to fear Russia's potential victory in Ukraine much more than its defeat. The Ukrainians' courage and determination to defend their independence is a historic chance for the United States and Europe to deliver a decisive blow to Russian imperialism and toxic nationalism. But so far, the major Western powers hesitate to throw their weight behind this outcome. Okay, tell us why you think a dismemberment of the Russian Federation is something we should not desire.
Well, I'm old enough to remember the collapse of the Soviet Union. And at that time, the American government was terrified of thousands of nuclear scientists, nuclear devices running around completely unconstrained. We did a lot of work, some of it wiser than others maybe, but in the end, we managed to contain that. But the actual dissolution of Russia, let's think about the human cost in the Caucasus, in Chechnya, the wars that might break out between Azerbaijan and Armenia on a much larger scale. Let's think about where China would be, what China might do in that situation. It's a catastrophe. And then we should also think there are there are millions of Russians who are not responsible in any way for what Putin has done. What happens to them in that situation? Does that actually enhance European security? I agree with the Estonians, the Poles, and the Ukrainians that a strong Russia is a threat to them. That's why I believe in a strong NATO alliance, and I believe that the war should end with Ukraine having ironclad security guarantees. But that, I don't think it's much harder to protect someone from chaos than from a power. And there is nothing to be gained in my mind from the collapse of civil authority and the outbreak of strife and war in Russia. Didn't make anybody happy in World War I. I don't think it would make anybody happy today.
Let me get Velina. Janice, I'll get to you in a second. Velina, where do you stand on the question of this being a unique historic opportunity to deliver a decisive blow to Russian imperialism?
Indeed, it is a unique moment, and in fact, we are facing this kind of bifurcation within Europe between the Franco-German bloc, which is pushing for, as I said, the status quo, coming back to the status quo before the war began, which I think is unrealistic. And then, of course, Central Eastern European countries, but also the Nordic countries. Think about the fact that two neutral countries, the one being neutral for the last 250 years, the other for more than 70 years, are now joining NATO this year. This is also showing actually how unique the moment has become. I think that we all indeed share the same interest on both sides of the Atlantic, that in fact a dismemberment of the Russian Federation, dissolution of the Russian Federation, weakening of this imperial project, geopolitical project, is in our common interest for the reason that neither the United States nor the European powers want to face a two-fronts scenario in the future, given the real challenge coming from China. So this modus vivendi of coordination that I was talking about just a year ago in your show, Steve, ahead of the beginning of the war, this is the real problem, the threat multiplier coming from Moscow and Beijing, while Beijing is realizing that it needs to protect its border in the north. It needs to have security that is guaranteed by Russia, while facing rising India and also military escalation with Taiwan. So obviously a weakened Russian isn't in the interest of the West. And I argue also that the dissolution of the Russian Federation may present Russians and hopefully the new generation within Russia with new opportunities. We should look at Russia as being under complete control of one specific clique, of the KGB-like clique of people. This is not a country that is being ruled by checks and balances the way how the West understands it. And this is not in our interest to have a KGB-like rule country that operates in our direct vicinity. So obviously, we should go for this for sure.
That's just some of what we've covered this week. You can find more, including the full conversations, on our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.